This question is meant to be a little bit of a challenge question because all of the other questions have started with a 1x squared here. But this one all of a sudden starts with a 2x squared. So the problem is that you can't use exactly the same method. The first thing that you have to do is you have to somehow translate this first term so that it looks like 1x squared. And the way that we're going to do that, we need 1x squared. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to factor out the coefficient that is currently on that x squared. So in this particular question, we would factor out the 2 coefficient. Okay, now it's going to look a little weird, but we're going to handle it here. So we factor out the 2. And remember, that is like you divide each of these terms by 2, 2, and 2. So when I do that, I'll get x squared minus x minus a half. And then close your parentheses is equal to 0. Okay? Now, we are trying to solve this equation. And because we're trying to solve this equation, we can get rid of this factor of 2. Okay? So we're going to factor out a factor of 2. And then once we do that, we're going to divide by that factor of 2. So I'll divide both sides by 2 and divide by 2. And that's going to cross out these 2's and give us x squared minus x minus a half is equal to 0. Okay? So this fact that we had a 2x squared here isn't going to really change anything for us because now we have translated it into a problem where we have a 1x squared. Okay? Now, once we have that 1x squared, then we're looking at a question like the other questions. So here is where we will add our number to the right-hand side so that we get a variable equal to a number. So that will look like x squared minus x equals, and then I'll add a half to both sides. Okay, and then at that point, what I will do is I'll do the same step of adding the plus b over 2 quantity squared. So I will add, now in this case my b is a -1, so I have -1 over 2 quantity squared. Now, we really have to spend some time thinking about this. This is a negative squared, so that's going to give us a positive, and then the 1 squared gives us 1 over the 2 squared would give us 4. So this b over 2 quantity squared is really a 1 over 4 that we're adding. So we would add 1 over 4 to the right-hand side. Okay, now I will go ahead and write this out like you have x squared minus x plus 1/4. But remember that this perfect square trinomial can be factored without going through that. It can be factored as x plus b over 2 quantity squared. So the easiest thing to do would be to say, okay, this is going to be x plus, and we notice here that our b over 2 is this -1/2. So it's going to be x plus -1/2 quantity squared equals, and then on the right-hand side, we have 2 fractions added together. So we're going to have to take a little moment here and say that this 1/2 plus 1/4, to get a common denominator, I would multiply this a half by 2 over 2. So that would give you 2 over 4 plus 1 over 4. And then now that they have a common denominator, we can say that it's 3/4. Okay? So that is 3/4. All right, so then at that point, it's like, okay, well, what am I going to do? I'm going to do the same thing that I normally did in the previous problems. I get rid of this square power. And to get rid of that square power, I'm going to take the square root of both sides. All right, now when I do that, the square and the square root undo each other. We have left over x plus minus, so that's just x minus a half equals plus or minus the square root of 3/4. Okay? And then just like I did before, I'll solve for x by adding a half to both sides. All right, so at that point, the simplification then becomes a little bit of a challenge, or a little bit more challenging than before, because what you're left with is this plus or minus the square root of 3/4 plus a half. And you can simplify that further. The way that you would simplify that further is the square root of 3 over the square root of 4 is the same as writing this as one big square root. And so you would plug in that this is plus or minus the square root of 3 over, and then the square root of 4 is just 2. So it would be plus or minus square root of 3 over 2 plus 1 over 2. Now, these both have a denominator of 2, so there's no reason for us to write it as two separate fractions. So what we would do then is we would combine it as one fraction. So we would combine this so that it looks like 2 in the denominator, and then in the numerator you would have plus or minus the square root of 3 plus 1 is equal to x. Okay, and again, if you look at this plus sign, that separates you into two separate terms, but those terms are unlike terms, so you would not go any further. One thing that I really want to make sure that everybody's okay with is do not include this plus or minus outside of the fraction. You'll hit the fraction bar, and then in the numerator you'll have the plus or minus square root of 3 plus 1, and then in the denominator you'll have the 2. So the plus or minus is solely in that numerator.